All right, Rabbi, say good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking our sponsors for this morning's share. To thank our TALMUD TORAH sponsors for the month of Elul, Shaindy and Avraham Kelman, dedicating all the shiurim and drashos this month in honor of the engagement of their son Yechiel to Ilana, Falick, and in memory of their parents Jerome and Bernice, Kelman, Alexander and Friderica, David. Alayim zichron Barak. We open the merit of our TALMUD TORAH, the neshamas will have an Elya, and the family a nechama. To thank Barak, Maia, Sandy, Hoffman, Dora, Lemus, and Melamed for dedicating the shiurim and drashos this month in honor and memory of Reuven ben Emanuel zichron Barak. We open the merit of our TALMUD TORAH, the neshama will have an Elya, and the family a nechama. And our Daf Yomi Shiur in the zechus of refuah sheleimah for Yehuda ben Michal. Our week of learning sponsors, Matt and Diane Marks, in celebrating the birth of their grandson, Yehuda Yeshaya ben Moshe Eliyahu, to their children Moshe Eliyahu and Tzippi Marks in Lakewood. May he grow Meretz Hashem, Michal El Chayil, do Maisim Tovim, and provide the mishpacha with nachas for many years to come. Mazel Tov, Mazel Tov, Mazel Tov. So we'll say with that, let us begin. So we'll say today's daf is Nun Dalid, but you would not know that based on where we are starting. So Meretz Hashem, we are picking up on Nun Gimel days, 53b, 14 lines down, but we're going to be all right. We're going to make it. Tomorrow's also a very short daf. Meretz Hashem, so the universe will be back in equilibrium. So we'll say we are picking up in Meretz Hashem, Amalei Rav Chisda Rav Yosef, 14 lines down from the top, 53b. We actually started this yesterday, but it's a good point of departure for today's shiur. Did you hear anything from Rav Yehuda regarding the following issue? Arusa yesh lo mezonos or ein lo mezonos? Doesn't Arusa have mezonos or doesn't have mezonos? Now, both remember again, to reorient ourselves a little bit, we started this yesterday. Remember, what is this dealing with? If you look at Rashi explains Arusa yesh lo mezonos. Rashi explains Arusa yisoma yesh lo mezonos mina achin olo. Remember, we're talking about over here, if a girl is orphaned. So remember again, as we've established, what's the halacha when it comes to an orphaned girl? She is supported by the estate of her deceased father. In other words, even though her brothers are the ones who inherit, she receives support from the estate. The shaila over here is as follows. Now this girl becomes an arusa. So the shaila is, as an arusa, is she still entitled to support from the estate? That's the question. Amarle, he said, Mashmalo Shmir, I suppose to remember again, this is Rav Chisda asking of Rav Yosef. So Rav Yosef said, Amarle, Mashmalo Shmir, the truth is, I never really heard anything explicitly about this, Ela Misvara, but I would say logically, Lesla. I would say logically that once she becomes an arusa, she's no longer supported by the estate. Why? Kevan di irsa lo nechale de tisra. So what's very interesting? Why does she no longer receive support from the estate? Because b'pashtos, once she becomes an arusa, that means she's connected to this man, to this aros. The aros is not going to want her to walk around in a compromised state. So therefore, by definition, once he realizes that she doesn't have a father, he is going to provide support for her. In other words, even though normally an arusa is not entitled to support from her aros, in this case where she is an orphan, the aros is going to recognize that he doesn't want his kala to walk around in a compromised state. He's going to support her. Therefore, the estate no longer has an obligation to support her. So Rav Chisda said back, Amalei, Imashmalo Shmielacha. So now let me get this straight. So you never heard any explicit answer to my question. You're advancing a svara. I would tell you, Misvara Isla. I could argue the opposite way. And I would say that based on logic, that she should be entitled to support from the estate. Why? Because at the end of the day, since the chassan doesn't say any time that there's erisin, right? You never know for sure if the marriage is going to continue forward, right? You never know what's going to happen. Because let me see, you might find some type of mum, you might find some kind of disqualifying factor. She may find some kind of disqualifying factor. He's not going to start spending significant money on her. In other words, it doesn't make sense logically for him to go ahead and spend serious money on her during erisin, because who knows what could happen? Who knows what he could discover? Who knows what she could discover? So therefore, again, interestingly enough, so Rav Chisda says back to Rav Yosef, if you're saying Misvara, I would say Svara would dictate that the Yisoma would still be supported by the estate. Okay, see Ikidami. So we'll say there's an alternate version of this discussion. Amrle, he said to him, Mashma lo shmieli, I never heard anything explicit about this question, but Misvara Isla. But I would say logically, it's also an alternate version of the previous discussion. But I would say Misvara, she should be entitled to support from her father's estate. Why? Because since the chassan doesn't know fully if he's going to marry her, in other words, he may discover something that may ultimately void the relationship, he's going to be reluctant to spend significant money on her. Misvara, I'm sorry. So Amar Lehi said back to him, if you have heard nothing explicit, Misvara less like, or argue just the opposite. Logically, she should not receive anything from the estate. Why? Kevan the irsa lo nichale detisal. Because halacha l'maisa, since they had erisin, an aros is not going to want his kala to walk around in a compromised state, and therefore bepashtos he is going to provide her with support. So both say, interestingly enough, the question is clear, the answer is not. Right? So the question is a very interesting one, which is halacha l'maisa. Here's what we've established. A girl, right, we already established in yesterday's daf that a girl is supported from her deceased father's estate until one of two events occur. What are the two events? Either bagrus or marriage. Here's the shayla, but marriage classically means what? Nisuin, because up through Erisin is when she's living in her father's home. Here's the shayla. So she's supported from the estate. What happens during Erisin? That's our question. Or in other words, we know until marriage, which part of marriage? Is she supported from her father's estate during Erisin or not? So I must say, if you notice, so what's the conclusion of the Gemara? The conclusion of the Gemara is very inconclusive. Right? In other words, the Gemara makes arguments both ways. Interestingly enough, the Rambam Paskins over here, the Rambam says, he says like this, the halacha is hama'aris pas hanizonos mina achin chayim mizonos mishas ha'irisin sharein lo mizonos mi'achera ela ad shetis ares. So we'll say the Rambam Paskins that when a girl is being supported from the estate of her father, so mizonos from the estate ends at irisin. That's how the Rambam Paskins. Therefore, from irisin and on, the husband will pick up the support obligation. That's how the Rambam Paskins. Good, let's go back there. Says the Gemara, bo'omine mirav sheshas. So we'll see some other interesting cases. Bo'omine mirav sheshas. Mima'enes, yesh lamazonos, ein lamazonos. What's an interesting case? Remember, we've seen this before. We spoke about. We focused on this much in Yevamis. So we'll say, so we know midaraisa, a father has an ability to marry off his daughter. Okay. Now remember, we also pointed out that let's say the father died, the mother or the brother has the ability also to marry off the daughter. But again, what kind of marriage is it? It's marriage midrabanan. So here's some vaharaya. If the girl who's in this marriage decides that she wants out, how does she terminate the marriage? She simply refuses. Miyun, that's all. She refuses the marriage and she's out of it. So we'll say, here's the interesting shayla. So now you have a girl who was married off, let's say, by her brother. Okay, so father's died. She's married off by her brother. She doesn't like the marriage anymore. She refuses. She does miyun. So now what's the shayla? Does she become entitled again to support from the estate? Right? So in other words, does she go back to being supported from the estate or not? So mima enes yesh lamazonos o ein lamazonos. Amar of sheshes. So we learn this. Amona bebeis aviha. Ugrusha bebeis aviha, vishomeres yafa bebeis aviha. If a girl is an almana in her father's home, in other words, she was widowed, or ultimately again she's divorced and she's living in her father's home, vishomeres yavam, or she's waiting yibum in her father's home, yesh lamazonos. Ultimately, again, she is entitled to mizonos. Now, if you look at Rashi, Yehuda Omer, Oda bebeis aviha yesh lamazonos, Eina bebeis aviha. So what Rabbi Yehuda says, if she's still in her father's home, she has mizonos. If she's not in her father's home, she doesn't have mizonos. Says the Gemara, sounds like they're saying the same thing. that if she's living in her father's home, she's entitled to mizonos. So Yehuda Hanu Tanakamo, Elalav Mima'enes Ikavenayu. Rabbi say, mostly the case of Mima'enes is the nafkamina. The Tanakama Savar Isla, the Tanakama holds that a Mima'enes is entitled to mizonos. Rabbi Yehuda Savar Lesla, and Rabbi Yehuda holds that ultimately, again, a Mima'enes is not entitled to mizonos. So I will say fundamental distinction ultimately between Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanan. So I will say, so again, fundamental machlokes, how do we paskin? So I will say, I'll just rather these off to you. The Rambam says, it's actually same parak. I didn't quote you before the Maramakom. This is all in Hilchos Ishus Parak Yud Tes. So the previous halacha that we discussed was halacha Tes Vov. This is halacha Yud Dalet. So listen to this. Bas hamima enes harei kishara bonos v'yesh lo mizonos. The Rambam paskins, if a girl does miyun, she is restored back to her father's home. So now in this case, the father's dead. She's restored back to the estate, and once again is supported from the estate. Incredible. So it's an interesting case. What about the daughter of the Yevama? Rabbi says, so just to understand what happens over here. Reuven was married to Rachel. Switching gears a little bit over here. Reuven is married to Rachel. Reuven's married to Rachel. Reuven dies without children. He dies without children. So Reuven has a brother, right? Rachel does Yibum with Shimon. Rachel and Shimon have a daughter. So I say, here's the shayla. So the Gemara says, so Yevama yesh lo mizonos ein lo mizonos. Is a Yevama entitled to mizonos or not? So I will say, so now watch this. So the Gemara says as follows. So Bas Yevama. So now again, remember the daughter of the Yevama, is she entitled to mizonos or not? So the Gemara says, Kelman Damar Kesuvos al Nichsei Baila Harishon. Now remember again, I'll say back to our Yevama stays a little bit. Rachel's Kesuva is against whose estate? Rachel's Kesuva is against Reuven's estate, right? Her deceased husband. Remember, Shimon has no obligation of a Kesuva. He has an obligation with the Kesuva satisfied through Reuven's. So do we say, therefore again, since Rachel's Kesuva comes from Reuven's estate, therefore Rachel's daughter is supported by Reuven's estate as well. So the Gemara says, given our marriage Kesuvos al Nichsei Baila Rishon Lesla, O Dilma Kevan de Isti Lesla Merishon Takino Le Rabbanon Misheni. So here's the interesting question. On one hand you could say, since Rachel's Kesuva, so let's play this out. Rachel's Kesuva comes from Reuven's estate, Reuven the deceased husband. Now remember, the obligation to support a daughter, Rabosai, is what? A Tnai Kesuva. Right? Ultimately, again, that is a function of Kesuva. So maybe daughter is supported from the estate. Daughter is supported from the estate that has the obligation of Kesuva. Since Kesuva obligation comes from Reuven's estate, therefore Rachel's daughter, even though her daughter is from who? From Shimon, the Yavam, should be supported from Reuven's estate. On the other hand, and therefore again, she's not entitled to any mizonos from Shimon's estate. On the other hand, what's the halacha if Reuven died and he had no money? Whose estate does Rachel's Kesuva come from? Right? Who does it? Comes from Shimon. So therefore, maybe Shimon has a support obligation. To which the Gemara says, Teku. The Gemara says ultimately, again, we're not exactly sure about that. The Gemara ends off without answering that. Okay, so we'll say, so that's the last part of this. So let's go back there. Fascinating idea. So we'll say, so I'll just tell you, in this case also, here, I didn't actually quote this. I didn't quote this over here from the Rambam. So the halacha is, we're going to see that ultimately in this case, where Reuven dies and he does not have an estate, or there is no money, so ultimately support obligation for Rachel's daughter will come from Shimon's estate. So Shimon will ultimately again have the obligation to support his biological daughter. Okay, beautiful. So let's go back there. By Reb Elazar. So Reb Elazar asked the following shayla. Bas shniya yesh lo mizonos ein lo mizonos. So it's an interesting case. Again, a lot of chazar from Yevamis today. Remember, there's a concept of a shniya. Shniya means a erva midrabanan. Right, so there's ervas d'oraisa, and then there are rabbinic ervas. Let's say a man marries a rabbinic erva. Excuse me. A man marries, no, I'm good, I'm fine. Thank you. A man marries a rabbinic erva. Asr, but marriage works. They have a daughter. So bas shnia, yesh la mazanos, ein la mazanos. Ultimately, again, I will say, interesting shaila. Is this girl entitled to mazonos or not? So here, she is the product of a rabbinically prohibited marriage. Is she entitled to mazonos? So top of Lundal, we'll say 54a. Kavan the less la ksuva, less la mizone. So we'll say, on one hand, remember, if a man marries a shnia, there's no ksuva, which makes sense. Chazal only instituted a ksuva when in a legal marriage. But if you're marrying illegally, there's no ksuva. So on one hand, we could say that since halacha l'maisa, when Reuven marries Rachel, and in this case Rachel is a shnia, so since there's no ksuva, there's also no support obligation for the daughter. Odilma kevan da avda Odilma ima da avda isura kansur rabbanon. Ihi de lo avda isura lo kansur rabbanon. I will say, on the other hand, maybe you could say, who did Chazal penalize? Chazal penalized the mother, because the mother did something wrong. She married illegally, but the daughter did nothing illegal, right? The daughter didn't do anything, so maybe she should not be penalized and she should receive mazonos, even though her mother does not have a ksuba, to which the Gemara says, teiku. Gemara leaves it open. Bayrava, Avrayz dekasha, Basarusa, yesh la mazonos, ein la mazonos. So here's an interesting case. The daughter of an arusa. And I will say, how exactly do you have the daughter of an arusa? So it's a simple case. Chassan and Kala clearly spent a bit too much time together. Right? So in this case over here, right, Reuven and Rachel. Now again, they're married. They had Erisin. They jumped the gun a little bit, right? They had Erisin, and now they have a child during Erisin. So we'll say, interesting shaila. So ultimately, again, so Reuven and Rachel married. They have a daughter. Is daughter entitled to mizonos during Erisin or not? So on one hand, kivan de isla ksuva isla. So we'll say, on one hand, interestingly enough, since Rachel has a ksuva, maybe the daughter has mizonos. So what does it mean Rachel has a ksuva? Look at Rashi. Kivan de isla ksuva, kivan kigon shekasav la mina Erisin. Inami rabbanon taku nami larusin. I will say, I just want to point out something interesting, because we see this back and forth a little bit, which is, you see this little bit of ambiguity in the Gemara as to at what point in time does a husband have an obligation for ksuva. Now the truth is, I already showed you the Rambam on this, and the Shulchan Aruch, and the Rambam Shulchan Aruch paskin, that halacha l'maisa, the obligation for a ksuva doesn't begin until nisuin. That's how they paskin. Even though that's how they paskin, the Gemara clearly goes back and forth with this yesod and identifies. So Rashi says, maybe we're talking about a case where a husband obligated himself in ksuva as of erisin, or no, maybe the core obligation for ksuva does exist as of erisin. So on one hand, maybe we say, since there's some type of ksuva obligation by erisin, therefore there's a chiyuv mizonos. So the Gemara says, oh Dilma, Kevin the lo takino the rabbanon ksuva ad shas nisuin lesla. Or maybe not. Maybe ksuva doesn't really apply up until nisuin, and therefore ultimately again there's no obligation of support. Teiku. So we'll say the Gemara once again says teiku. Good. So by Reb Papa, another kasha. Reb Papa asked the following: Anusa yesh lamazonos ein lamazonos. We'll say a very interesting case. Let's say a man violates a woman. Reuven violates Rachel. They have a daughter. Right? They have a daughter. So now is Reuven obligated in the support of this daughter? To which the Gemara says, well, let's analyze. So the Gemara says, Alibut Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, Loti Bailacha, Damar Yesh La Ksuva Mana. So it's according to Rabbi Yossi, that's not a shayla, because Rabbi Yossi Yehuda holds, and also remember again, what's talacha when a man violates a woman? What's talacha? So remember again, we did this sugi, we spent a lot of time on this. So first of all, there's multiple forms of repayments, right? There's knas, there's sheves, there's ripui, there's boshes, and there's also an obligation to marry her, right? There's also, the only people who could object to the marriage are the woman herself or her father, right? The violator cannot. So interestingly enough, Rabbi Yosef Yehuda holds there is also a ksuva. he's obligated in ksuva to her. So therefore, obviously, since there's a ksuva, that also means that he has an obligation to what? To support the daughter. Support the daughter. So kiti ba'ilachali b'drabanan. The amriyotze kesef knasa b'ksuvasa. They both say the shayla is going to the Rabbanon. Now the Rabbanon hold that halacha l'maisa there is no ksuva. The Rabbanon hold that the penalty payment is in lieu of a ksuva. So Rabbi say, so according to them, here's the shayla. So what do we say? Kevan the less la ksuva, less la mazone. So do we say that since there's no ksuva, therefore violator Reuven has no support obligation towards his daughter? O dilma ksuva taimamai. Rabbi say, why did Chazal institute a ksuva? We actually never explicitly articulated this, but it is interesting to point out. We'll say ultimately, we did articulate it. We'll talk about it more in depth. Why did Chazal institute a ksuva? I will say the Gemara says, "Kedei shalote kala be'inov lo tzia." What were Chazal concerned about? Chazal were concerned that if divorce was too easy, a man might simply get upset at his wife and what? Summarily divorce her. Remember, I will say, since the whole get process is a little bit, remember, it's not, the power is not equally vested in both parties. Right? The power of the get is certainly shifted towards the husband. So the husband could just summarily divorce his wife. So how did Chazal level the playing field a little bit between husband and wife? Ultimately, a ksuva. Because what a ksuva says is fine, you want to get divorced, okay, but there is a significant financial payout. So therefore, that significant financial payout causes a husband to be a little bit more dispassionate in making his decision. So the Gemara says, therefore, ksuva is there to make a husband think twice about getting divorced. However, in this case, v'hala matzi mafikla. Now, I will say, in this case of the violator, do you need a ksuva? No. Why? Because the Torah itself says, lo yuchal l'shalcha, that ultimately, again, the violator is never permitted to go ahead and divorce his wife. So therefore, maybe over here, there's no ksuva, but because there's no ksuva, therefore what? There's also no support obligation, to which once again the Gemara says, teku. So the Gemara leaves it as an open-ended question. So the Gemara goes weiter. So remember, we're working our way through the Mishnah. What did the Mishnah say? The Mishnah pointed out that halacha l'maisa, one of the other clauses in the ksuva, is that halacha l'maisa, the husband says, if I die, and you are a widow, so halacha l'maisa, you can live in my home all the days of your widowhood. So it sounds like from the Mishnah that halacha l'maisa, the widow has the ability to live in the estate up until the time that she gets remarried. So let's analyze this a little bit. So both say really fascinating sugya. So Tani Rav Yosef, bebeisi v'lo bebiksi. You can live in my house, but not my hut. Now, what does that mean? Take a look at Rashi. Right across. We'll say first wide line on Nundal 54a. First wide line Nundal Aleph, right across in Rashi. Bebeisi v'lo bebiksi. Im yesh lo bayis kofen es yarshin lo seis la mother lefi kvoda ve'ein yecholin lomar lo lechila beis avicha va'anu zanen osach sham. We'll say very interesting halacha. Assuming the husband has a home that is large enough for everyone, the widow has the right to live in the home. And the Yisomim, the orphans, because I will say, these cases make most sense if you imagine they are talking about a widow who is not the mother of the orphans. So now, father dies, sons inherit the estate, and there is this woman living with them. Now, granted, the woman is their stepmother, is their father's wife, but not all situations of step parents necessarily work out well. So the idea is like this. I might have thought that the orphans could say, "Listen, thank you, you are a wonderful wife to our father, but we don't want to live together. So you go live in your father's home, go back to your family. We will support you. We'll provide you with support." So what the Mishnah teaches us is that halacha l'maisa, assuming that the home is large enough to accommodate all of them, the Yisomim do not have a right to force her out. They don't have a right to tell her that she has to go live somewhere else. However, Rashi says, "Aval ein lo bayis ela biksa ba'alma." Let's say the father did not leave behind a house, but instead a hut. They will say a hut is a bit hyperbolic. What it means is the house is too small for everyone to live in. In that case, the Gemara says, "Yecholin lomar lechi me'etzleinu da'at tehiyasva bebeisi kasav l'chavalo bebiksi. In that case, the Yisomim can tell her, listen, we're going to support you, but you can't live here. The house is not big enough for all of us. And I will say, the idea over here is that Rav Yosef is darshaning. He says to her, you can live in my house. House by definition means what? A domicile capable of accommodating everyone. But if the domicile is not capable of accommodating everyone, they can tell her, you move out and we'll support you. Avamazoni isla, but they have to support her. Mar Baravashi or Marfila Mazoni Nami Lesla. It's very interesting. Mar Baravashi says, no. If the house is too small and she has to leave, ultimately, again, Rav Mar Baravashi says they're not even obligated to support her. We will say, now, interestingly enough, what's the logic behind that? Sounds like, according to Mar Baravashi, the support obligation is a function of living together. Once they can't live together, by definition, there is no longer any support. The Gemara says, furthermore, v'les hilchasa k'mar baravashi. The halacha does not follow Mar Baravashi, and even in a situation where, let's say, the house is not big enough to accommodate all of them, and therefore she's going to move, they still have an obligation to support her. Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Shmuel. Interesting case here. Tavoli no say v'nispaisa ein la mazonos. What's here's an interesting case. So let's say Reuven's married to Rachel. And Reuven dies. So now says, what's happening? Assuming the house is large enough, so Rachel is living in the house. Rachel's also being supported by the estate. Now let's say Rachel gets a marriage proposal. Right? So Tavolina, say she gets a marriage proposal, call it from Shimon, v'nispaisa, and she accepts. So what's the halacha? Ein la mazonos. I will say, once she accepts a marriage proposal, halacha l'maisa, support ends. I will say, now what's the logic? Rashi points out over here, because remember again, the lashon of the clause in the ksuva is you will live in my home, kol yemei megar al menosayich, all the days of your widowhood. So the idea the Gemara is saying is, once she accepts a marriage proposal, then what? Her widowhood has effectively come to an end. Now, what's interesting about this is, it sounds like the acceptance of the marriage proposal, even without formal erisin. The idea is that she has accepted a marriage proposal that, by definition, ends the widowhood and therefore ends the support as well. Incredible. So the Gemara says, "Halonis baisa yesh mazonos," which sounds like if she didn't accept the marriage proposal, she still has mazonos. Amra Ravanan said, "L'didim farshleimini dimar Shmuel." Listen to this. Amra machmas ploni bali yesh mazonos. I'm sorry. Amra machmas ploni bali yesh mazonos. Machmas b'nei adam she'enu muganin la ein la mazonos. Supposed to listen to this. This is actually quite fascinating. Ravanan said, I think it's even more than this. If she's receiving marriage proposals, right, and she says, I can't accept. I'm too. Right. I still feel too connected to my husband. Right. I don't feel it's right. So I will say, if she's declining marriage proposals because of her husband, or because of her deceased husband, then it's still called that she's in her widowhood, and she still receives support. But if halacha l'maisa, she's declining marriage proposals, why? Because Mr. Right number 2 has still not come onto the scene. That shows that her widowhood is effectively over, and the zonos is terminated. In other words, both say, essentially what Ravanan is saying is, if she's dating, right, wonderful for her, but if she's dating, that seems to be an indication that this chapter of widowhood has come to an end, and therefore, again, mizonos is terminated. Amrav Chisda, zinsa ein la mizonos. Well, let's listen to this case. Rav Chisda said, what if she committed an act of znus? They will say, now znus is relative over here. What does znus mean in this case? She had relations with a man. They will say, now to be clear, she's not married, right? It's not znus in terms of like punishable znus. The idea is she had an intimate relationship with another man. So they will say, not marriage. Znus ein la mizonos. She no longer has zonos. So we'll say the idea of being intimate with another man indicates to us that what? Her widowhood has come to an end. So Rav Yosef, kichla upirkisa ein la mizonos. I will say, if she's applying makeup, kichla upirkisa means she's making herself look attractive. Now, why is a woman making herself look attractive? Ultimately, because she wants to get remarried. Right? They will say, by the way, it's also interesting. you find this fascinating. The idea, like today, if you would ask, it's like I think it's just how societal norms change. It would be interesting to see, like if a woman puts on makeup, so a lot of dafka, she's doing it for others. She's doing it for herself. A person wants to feel. So it's just fascinating. I think these are societal things. Bismana Gemara, if a woman is putting on makeup and accessories, she's doing it, and she's not married. If she's married, she's doing it for her husband. If she's not married, she's doing it why? Why? To get married. It's just these societal nuances are fascinating. In any event, if she goes in and she puts on makeup and accessories, in Lamazonos, that indicates to us that halacha l'maisa, she has intention to get remarried, and therefore the mazonos obligation ends. So mandamar zinsa kol shkein kichlo birkisa. So the opinion that says zinsa certainly includes getting dressed up, right? Door accessories and makeup. Mandamar kichlo birkisa. But the one who says that if she starts putting on makeup and accessories, that her mazonos ends, would say, however, aval zinsa isla. Even if she was intimate with another man, halacha l'maisa, she still receives mazonos. My taima, yetzer ansa. Rabbi say yetzer ansa means what? She had a moment of weakness. She had a moment of weakness, which I will say, by the way, what a profound Gemara to learn. In other words, Rachel lost her husband. She's a widow. She had a moment of weakness and she was intimate with another man. But I will say, everyone has moments of weakness. So what's interesting about this is, don't let the moment of weakness indicate that her mourning for her husband or her connection to her deceased husband has come to an end. She's still a widow. And she's still living in that widowhood. She had a moment of weakness and ultimately again committed an act of znus. But the Maia says she's still in kol yemei meger amenosayach. Which I will say, by the way, is something so fascinating. Because what is the Gemara saying? What is the Gemara saying? That you could commit an avera, right? You could have a lapse, but the lapse doesn't remove you from your primary state. So Rachel had a lapse, but the lapse doesn't remove her from her widowhood. I was saying, this is such good news for us. Because what does it tell me? What it tells me is my state, Rabbi said, my state of being is banim atam Hashem Elokechem. My state of being is that I'm a child of the Ribono Shel Olam. My state of being is that va'atem hadvekim Hashem Elokechem. I am davak, I cling to Hashem. My state of being is that I am in love with the Ribono Shel Olam, and I try to always be with Him. But sometimes what happens? Yetzer al b'sham. Sometimes I have a lapse. So sometimes we think that the lapse removes me from my primary state. I'm no longer a son of HaKadosh Baruch Hu after my lapse. I no longer have zechus to Hashem after my lapse. But what do you see from here? Not true. A lapse is a lapse, but that's exactly what it is. It's a momentary removal, but it does not go ahead and fully remove me from my primary state. Just like Rachel remains a widow, despite the fact that she was intimate with another man, it was a lapse. So too, even when we have our lapses in life, which we all experience, those lapses do not remove us from our primary state of connection to the Ribono Shel Olam. Such an incredible and overwhelming Gemara. So Gemara says, by the way, the Gemara says, the halacha does not follow any of these rulings. Rather, how do we hold? Elya kihal. Turn to Yehuda Yeshaya. Hatova ask Kesuvos based in ein lamazonos. So I will say it's interesting. Halacha l'maisa. At what point in time does support from the estate come to an end? When she claims her ksuva. I will say halacha l'maisa, when Rachel shows up in Beis Din and she says, "Okay, I want my ksuva." At that point in time, the moment she claims ksuva, mizonos ends. Now, obviously, if she gets remarried, of course, mizonos ends. At the moment of remarriage, the estate would also pay her out her ksuva and she would be done. But the idea is, even if we see that she's dating, she's getting dressed up, she's going to shidduch, she put together her shidduch resume, all these different things, halacha l'maisa, mizonos remains until she claims her ksuva. The Gemara says, V'lo, Vatanya, we learned, Machra ksuvasa, Mashkina ksuvasa, Asasa Kesuvos Apotiki. So we'll say, listen to this case. If a woman sold her Kesuva, or she collateralized her Kesuva, or she made her Kesuva an Apotiki. Apotiki means, right, an appointed place of repayment. La'achar, she did this to someone else. Ila Mazonos. So we'll say, in other words, if she did any of these things with her Kesuva, she does not have Mazonos. Hani in Tova'as lo. So we'll say, it sounds like only if she did these things with her Kesuva. But not if she claimed the Kesuva. To which the Gemara says, no. Hani bein bebezdin, bein shelo bebezdin. So the Gemara says, these items, if she utilized her Kesuva in any of these ways, in Bezdin, outside of Bezdin, that effectively ends Mazoros. However, Tovas, bebezdin in shelo bebezdin lo. But if she claims her Kesuva, I will say the moment she claims her Kesuva, either in Bezdin or outside of Bezdin, that ends Mazoros. So therefore I will say, Halacha l'maitzvah comes out of here is as follows. That if a woman claims, she asks for her payment of her Kesuva, whether she asks for that payment in Bezdin or outside of Bezdin, the Mazoros obligation comes to an end. That's possibility one. Possibility two, if she uses her Kesuva in some type of business transaction. She sells the Kesuva, collateralizes the Kesuva, uses the Kesuva as a form of repayment. Halacha l'maaseh, at that point, Mazonos obligation ends as well. Let's go weiter. The kachayu anshe yisham. So let's remember again, the Mishnah contained an interesting machlokes. What was the machlokes? The machlokes in the Mishnah was as follows. The Mishnah quotes and says that halacha l'maaseh, the support obligation, right? The minhag of Yerushalayim and the Galil was that a husband was obligated, the estate was obligated to support the widow all the days of her widowhood, right? And the estate would just have to bear the support. In Yehuda, they had an interesting phrase. In Yehuda, they would write Ad sheyirtzu hayarshim litin ksuvasech. In Yehuda, they had an interesting right that the yarshim, the inheritors, could choose to pay. They could support her, but they could also choose to terminate support by paying out her ksuva whenever they decided. So an interesting distinction. So again, in Yerushalayim and the Galil, the estate had to support the widow until the widow decided to collect her ksuva or she gets remarried. In Yehuda, power was vested in the heirs. And the heirs could decide at any point in time, we don't want to support you anymore. Here's your ksuva, hatzlacha rabba. So says the Gemara, Itma Rav Amar Allah K'Anshe Yehuda. Rav says Allah is like Anshe Yehuda. Ushmuel Amar Halacha K'Anshe Galil. And Shmuel says no, the halacha is like Anshe Galil. I both say Galil is Galil and Yerushalayim. Galil. So the Gemara says Bavel v'chol parvada no karav. So Bavel and all the surrounding areas conducting themselves like Rav. Narda v'chol parvada no kushmuel. And I both say Narda, and all the surrounding areas ultimately went ahead and conducted themselves like Shmuel. Like Shmuel, good. Says the Gemara, listen to this. So Ahi Bas Mechuza Dahavin Sibel Narda. There was a lady from Mechuza who married a man from Narda. Asula Kamei Rav Nachman. So ultimately, again, they came before Rav Nachman. Shamala Kala de Bas Mechuza. He heard from her accent that she was from Mechuza. Amar Lahu Pavel V'Chol Parvada Kirav Kino Kirav. So apparently Mechuza was an outlying city of Bavel. So Rav Nachman said, Bavel and all of its surrounding areas, Paskin like Rav. Amrullah, they said to him, but this lady married a guy from Narda. Amrullahu ihachi Narda v'chol parvada no kishmuel. Ultimately, again, Narda and all the surrounding cities ultimately conducted themselves like Shmuel. V'ad heicha Narda. And we'll say, how far does Narda extend? So the Gemara says, ad heicha desagi kabed Narda. Up until the area where they used the Nardoin measurements. Okay, so we'll say, so fundamental machlokes in the Mishnah. Again, and I will say, this was just based on locale. So in some places, the support obligation of a widow continued until the widow herself got remarried or demanded her ksuva. Yeah, that was in Yerushalayim and Galil. In Yehuda, ultimately support of the widow was dependent on the heirs. The heirs could support her as long as they want, but the moment they decided they didn't want to, they had the right to pay out her ksuva and support ended. Itmar, Rabbi say another interesting halacha. Almana, Rabbi say, now listen to this. We're transitioning now to ksuva. So assuming now the estate is ready to pay out the ksuva of the almana. Rav Amar Shamin Masha Aleha. We'll say this is fascinating. So almana shows up to Beis Din. Rav says, included in the valuation of the ksuva is the clothing that she's wearing. Her clothing is considered to be the property of the estate. So we'll say, if you can imagine, right, so Rachel is married to Reuven. Reuven dies. Rachel decides now she wants to strike out on her own. So therefore, again, she demands her ksuva. She comes to Beis Din. She shows up to Beis Din, she's wearing her mink, right, wearing her fur coat. So Beis Din says, okay, Rav says, fine, but that fur coat, by the way, that's the property of the estate. And therefore, that's fine, it's yours, but it's part of the ksuva valuation. Shmuel says, no, no, clothing belongs to her. Clothing was given to her, and therefore Allah Chalamaysa is not part of the valuation of the estate. Both say the opposite is a lokit. Now both say a lokit was a worker. Now this is an interesting arrangement. The lokit, both say, was someone who worked for you. You didn't pay him a wage. He lived in his house. He lived in your house. Essentially, you gave him room, board, and clothing. So the Gemara says they held the opposite by the worker. Rav Kahana Masni v'chein b'lokit. Rav Kahana said, no. The same opinions about whether or not clothing belongs to the individual, belongs to the estate. The same machlokis by a wife is the same machlokis by a worker. V'chein b'lokit umanach basimna yasma v'armalta shalakupok. Amrav Nachman avagad v'samasi sekavasi d'Shmuel. Even though we learned in the Mishnah like Shmuel, hilchas sakavasi d'Rav. The halacha still follows Rav. Disnan. Echad hamakdish nechasav, ve'echad hamarches atzmo. But say if a person consecrates his property or a person pledges his value to the Beis Hamikdash, ein lo biksus ishto, velo biksus banav. A person has no rights in the clothing of his wife, right, and not in the clothing of his children. Velo b'tzeva shetzava lishman, or even dies that he died on their behalf. Velo b'sandalim chadashim shalakach lishman, not even with new shoes that he purchased from him but didn't yet give them. So we'll say, what does this indicate? What this indicates is the clothing of a wife belongs to who? To a wife. It's hers. Now we'll say, interestingly enough, this is the position ultimately again of Shmuel, but yet the Gemara says the halacha still follows Rav. I don't understand. If you just quoted a Mishnah that paskins like Shmuel, why would the halacha be like Rav? Amalei lichora ki Shmuel riata ki ma'ayanta ba hilchasa kavasei derav. Even though at first glance it looks like the halacha follows Shmuel, when you delve a bit more into it, the halacha follows Rav. How so? So the Gemara says, "My taima." What's the reason? Ki akni la adaita lemekam kamei adaita lemishkal lemefak lo akni la. Because they will say again the pashtos. When a husband gives his wife something, I will say, why does a husband give his wife something? It's with the understanding that what? That they're going to be married. Right? That's the intention. That's why a husband gives his wife stuff. He doesn't give her stuff with the intention that they're no longer going to be married. And therefore, again, I will say, that is why Shmuel paskins that halacha, that's why Rav paskins that halacha l'maisa, when let's say the estate is settled. In this case, the payment of the ksuva, ultimately, again, part of that payment includes the clothing that she is wearing. And I will say, I'll point out, interestingly enough, the Rambam Paskis, something interesting. The Rambam Paskis is in Hilchos Ishos. Perek Taznayin Alocha Daled, the Rambam says, V'chein eskinu, shekishetavod ligbos ksuva sa'acham oso, lo skod, he goes on, he says, V'shamin la masha aleha. Incredible. The Rambam Paskins, that Alocha l'maisa, what she comes wearing to Beis Din, ultimately, again, is included in the ksuva settlement. So, halacha l'maisa, even the clothing on her back, ultimately, again, becomes part of the ksuva settlement. The Gemara goes weiter. Kalsa devei Rabbi Yashav, hava katava ksuvas miyasi. So, I'll say the daughter-in-law, or a daughter-in-law of the house of Bar Yashiv wanted to collect her ksuva from the estate. In other words, the widow wanted to collect her ksuva from the estate. So what happens? So the Gemara says, she took, so the widow was taking the orphans to Beis Din. Amri, so the sons, the inheritors said, Zila lan milsa de tistali hachi. So the Gemara says, Azla levishtinu v'achsetinu l'kulei mana. Listen to this. So the orphans said to the widow, fine, we'll come with you to Beis Din, but do me a favor. We are a chashav family. Make sure to come dressed very nicely to Beis Din. They said, come dressed very nicely. So the widow said, fine. She went ahead and she dressed up very nicely, right? She put on all of her nice clothing. So ultimately, again, it's fine. But ultimately, again, they came up for Ravina. Ravina said, by the way, Paskin like Rav. Again, I will say, this was a case, and it sounds like the backstory was that the Yisomim felt that the widow was taking a certain advantage of the estate, and they wanted the Beis Din to see all the stuff that she has. So she came wearing all of her nice adornments, and Ravina said, wonderful, beautiful, we're going to give you your ksuva, but understand, those items are part of the ksuva settlement as well. The Gemara goes weiter. So, Hahu da'amr lahu nedunya libras. Supposed to listen to this. Hahu da'amr lahu nedunya libras. Ultimately, I will say, here's the case. A man goes ahead and says, now Rashi says this is a shchid. A man who's on his deathbed. And he wants to go ahead and give a certain dowry to his daughter. Look at Rashi, second to last line Rashi. But it's like a man established a certain amount of items for nedunya, for property, for dowry for his daughter. He's on his deathbed, he's establishing dowry. What's talacha? Zol nedunya. I will say, let's say again, the nedunya depreciates. So the Gemara becomes cheaper. Amravidi bar Avin, Purna liyasmi. Ultimately, again, any profits go to the Yisum. In other words, we'll say, let's say halacha l'maisa. So let's say the father said, I want to give items A, B, C, D, and E to my daughter. And we'll say, let's say the price of the value of those items go down. So on one end, we could say, maybe what the father was guaranteeing was what? The value of the items. So now that the item is appreciated, you have to give her more for a dowry. To which the Gemara says, no. What we look at, I will say, is the father wanted to give her those things. Even though those items appreciated in value, give her those things. The idea is any type of swing in profit remains with the estate. Similarly, again, a man says about his daughter, Amr Bezer will say, a man says, I want to give 400 zuz worth of wine to my daughter. This was the dowry, right? 400 zuz worth of wine to my daughter. So, Iyakir Chamra. I will say, now what happened? I will say, so let's say for argument's sake, at the time that he said it, let's say 400 zuz worth of wine was 100 barrels. And then what happened? Iyakir Chamra. Wine goes up in value. So now again, it's only 80 barrels. So what's that? Rav Yosef, Rav Chaliyasmi. Ultimately, we'll say, so again, remember, the idea here always is, any change in status, the profit always goes to the estate. Krevi Rabbi Yochanan, Havelu Isas Abba, Dava Kamafse Damazoi. Both a very interesting case over here. Relatives of Rabbi Yochanan, had literally again a wife of their father, which means again, so relatives of Rabbi Yochanan had a widow living in their home, right? So the father died, the widow is living in the house. Listen to this. Apparently, she ate a lot. So she is burning through mizonos like no one's business. Right? So we'll say, so what's going on over here? So Asula Kami Rabbi Yochanan. So they come before Rabbi Yochanan. Amr Lahu. So Rabbi Yochanan says like this. Aizil va'amru leilabuch. And I will say, now I want to point out over here. What's happening over here is the father's still alive. In other words, here's the interesting case. It sounds like they're the kids, right? So we'll call Reuven's married to Rachel, right? Reuven's got his sons. The sons are looking like Rachel, and she is like a mizono tsunami over here, right? So she's blowing through the estate. So the problem is the kids, not that anyone wants to think about the demise of their parent, but, right, one day the kids are going to inherit the estate. At this rate, Rachel is literally eating through their inheritance. So the shaila just is, do they have a mechanism? So let's listen to this. So they come before Rabbi Yochanan. So Rabbi Yochanan says, listen, Amr Luhu, Eizlu v'Amr Lu'abuchun, Diniyachet Luhu Ara L'Mizona. Go tell your father that your father should tell his wife, this field is for your mizonos. In other words, be miyachet property for her mizonos. Now what does that do? What's the benefit of that? The benefit of that is, listen, Rachel, do whatever you want. You want to eat this field clean, eat it clean. But Lamaisa, this is what you have. Your Mazonos obligation is tethered or is rooted in this field. Fine, so we'll say sounds like a pretty good answer. So by the way, so after they got this psak, which seems to address their issue, so we'll say, such what Rabbi Yochanan was saying is, you could remove the Mazonos lien from the property and essentially vest from the general, what's called, remove the Mazonos lien from what? From the estate and vest it in one parcel. So they came and they told Reish Lakish this great Eitz Rabbi Yochanan. So Amaluhu Kol Shekin Sharibu Lamazonos. No. What you know what your father just did? He didn't remove the lien from the estate. He actually just added on another source of mizonos for her. Amrulei v'harav Yochanan lo amar hachi. So they said to Reish Lakish, excuse me. Go say, right? It's a funny conversation. Reish Lakish, I mean, I know you're a great Rav and everything, but you know Rabbi Yochanan didn't say this. Rabbi Yochanan argued. So listen to this. Amar lahu zilu havala. You better give her all the mizonos you want. V'ilo, and if you do not, mafikna luchu Rabbi Yochanan me'unaycha. I'm going to remove Rabbi Yochanan from your ears, which Rashi says is an expression of excommunication. Right? I am right, Rabbi Yochanan is wrong, and if you try to conduct yourself like Rabbi Yochanan, I will have you excommunicated. So Asl Kali Rabbi Yochanan. So I'll say they came back to Rabbi Yochanan. They're like, you're not going to believe what just happened. Reish Lakish paskin against you, and he threatened us that if we paskin like you, he's going to excommunicate us. Amr lahu ma'aseh shekinegdi chaluk alai. What can I do? Ultimately, again, Reish Lakish is as great as I am. He's arguing on me, and I listen. You gotta listen to him. Some Rabbi Avo. So I'll say now. I'll point out to Rabbi say that. But by the way, what's the machlokes over here? What's the machlokes? Rabbi say the fundamental machlokes is like this. Rabbi Yochanan clearly feels that although halakha v'maisa mizonos is an obligation on the estate, like any other obligation on the estate, you could choose to go ahead and connect that obligation to a particular parcel. I will say no different, by the way, that if halakha l'maisa man has an obligation of ksuva, the ksuva devolves upon the entire estate. If a husband says to his wife, he makes a particular field in apoteki, she has to agree to it, right? And that field that's your ksuva, if she accepts it, it works. Rabbi Yochanan is going to say the same thing short from mizonos. Reish Lakish argues. Reish Lakish says, no. The obligation of mizonos is an all-encompassing obligation. And you cannot remove it from the estate and vest it in one particular parcel. So both say, the Gemara ends off by saying, Amar Rabbi Avo, the Didim Ifar Shalem Inid Rabbi Yochanan, Amar Lemizonos Ribala, the Gemara says, Lemizonos Ribala, Lemizonos, Amar Lemizonos, I'm sorry, Lemizonos Ribala, the Gemara says, Ribala Mizonos. So both say, if halacha l'maisa, so both say, at the end of the day, Rabbi Yochanan says like this, it all depends on how you phrase it. If a husband says to his wife, this field is going to be for you limizonos. Limizonos is providing her with an extra source for her mizonos. Bimizonos, however, if he says, this field is for you bimizonos, so what does bimizonos mean? Bimizonos means for your, right? Limizonos means for your ksuva. Bimizonos means in your ksuva obligation. What it means is bimizonos is a limitation. This field for you is bimizonos, then ultimately cuts. I will say that's how the Rambam paskins. The Rambam says that if he says this field is limizonos, then he's giving her an extra source of collection. Bimizonos, ultimately, again, halacha l'maisa, he's going ahead and he's limiting her collection from this particular field. I will say, hadrin alach nara mazel tov. We have another minute. Let's begin the next parak. Another minute. Even though we learned in halacha l'maisa, actually, we'll say, we'll stop here. Good. We began the Mishnah. We'll stop here. We'll say mazel tov. And by the way, don't worry. We'll say, you see, tomorrow is a very short daf. We are right back on track. Baruch Hashem. Shkoyach. All right, Chevron, everyone have a wonderful, wonderful day. Shkoyach. Great to see you. Thank you. Amen. I think the Gemara is using it in separate ways and ashes to use two different terms. Right, totally taking over. Take a look. It's a great passion.